Alright, here's what's gonna happen, everyone. You clicked on this video because I had a funny little Jester guy in the thumbnail, and you thought, oh hey, I want to learn more about this funny little Jester guy. So we're gonna talk about the funny little Jester guy. We'll laugh, we'll cry, we'll laugh some more at the misfortune of everyone who gets invaded by this nonsensical build. And then we're gonna move on to something else. I'll then deliver a monologue about video games and how making them is actually super easy. And that's why every video game that comes out is super successful and beloved by their fan bases. I'm also going to tell a very specific subset of this community and gamers in general to shut their mouths on a very specific subject. I'll do all of this in the nicest way possible. During said monologue, I'll show you clips of intellectual pleasures like hosts getting blown up by great oracular bubble, or players perishing, withering, and yes, even succumbing to the mist. Alright, are we on the same page here? Good, let's get it over with. I should make something clear to everyone watching this. This is a deeply unserious video about a deeply unserious build, and it's something you're just gonna have to kind of accept. But unserious does not mean unfun, and I'm hoping you're able to see this through these invasions that I'm going to show you in the background here. This is Faulo the Jester, and believe me, this was not the name I wanted to go with initially. My general idea was that this was the court jester to Queen Ranala, and like many things in Raya Lucaria, he would be slightly eccentric, but mostly demented. I wanted to name this character something like the Carian Fool, which would convey their role as a jester, but also be a neat little reference to the tarot card, the Fool. But, as always, in the infinite wisdom of Bandai Namco's name filter, the word Fool is censored. That is right, ladies and gentlemen, you can use any number of slurs as long as you spell them in all caps. But nope, couldn't bear to call your own character a fool. So here are the stats and gear. What should jump out to you immediately is that I am wearing 2 Soar Seals. That might seem like lunatic behavior, and you'd only be kind of right, but allow me to explain. You see, the funny thing about rune level 30 is that stats are simultaneously super important and also entirely meaningless. What do I mean by that? Well, the meaningful part of stats is what makes double Soar Sealing work. Giving myself what amounts to 40 points drastically increases my defenses across the board, which then almost offsets taking 30% more damage. To bolster that a little, I use the Opaline Heart tier, which does help quite a bit. But the point about stats not mattering is that you can pour every one of your available stat points into a damage stat and get almost nothing back in terms of damage returns at rune level 30. So what ends up being nice about double Soar Sealing it at rune level 30 is that you just have a large breadth of weapons to choose from, and they all do very different things. So for example, my main weapon on this build is actually the Bloody Hellas of all things, which does not even remotely scale with Int, my highest non-vigor related stat, but is still a very powerful weapon at this level simply because I am able to wield it. In a moment, I'll go through all of the different weapons and tools I use, but first, I want to highlight the most important one, that of course being Great Oracular Bubble. Someone in my Discord said to me that this build seems like a rune level 50 build that I'm trying to make at rune level 30, and that person was so right. After all, Great Oracular Bubble requires 25 int and 18 arcane, and I am hellbent on casting it at rune level 30. A different person also said Great Oracular Bubble also seems like a very silly thing to make an entire build around. And again, so true, bestie. But let me tell you, there are very, very few greater joys in Elden Ring than hitting someone with the big bubble. It's also not all that hard to hit people with the bubble either. When you begin this long, big charge up of the spell and out pops this comically sized bubble, you can see your opponents start to laugh at you for casting this thing in the first place. But as their attention and a large portion of their screen is focused on the giant bubble of doom floating towards them, that's when you cast Gravity Well to pull them into said bubble of doom. I was a little bit worried when I put this build together that maybe Big Bubble wouldn't do big damage at this level, but it does very good damage. It does like 500 damage at this rune level. Of course, it's boosted by the magic crack tier or whatever in my physic, but yeah, 500 damage is kind of what you can come to expect. Which at this level is most of people's health. And you'd be surprised how often this works, even against people who seem to know what they're doing in the game. I watched Saint Riot cast Big Bubble at much higher levels, and he kept using collapsing stars to pull people into the bubble, which honestly is a little overkill. Gravity Well honestly might be a better option regardless of rune level. Gravity Well has a much shorter cast time, costs quite a bit less FP to cast, and for lower levels has a very reachable intelligence requirement. You also just don't need the most amount of pull to pull people into the bubble. You just need to like stop them in their tracks and pull them, just like inch them a little bit closer to the bubble, and that should detonate the big bubble of doom. I should also mention something that's incredibly nice about rune level 30, and it's that the overleveled downscaling algorithm actually kind of works at this level. Like, overleveled summons still do more damage than their hosts at this rune level, but they can very easily be outdamaged, and most importantly, they are incredibly mortal. No longer are these overleveled summons the invincible teabagging monsters of rune level 50 and above. Now they are just idiots who press L2 one too many times and die like any other tarnished in the lands between. The downscaling algorithm seems to be like a bell curve, where it works at the beginning of the game, then gets progressively worse at around rune level 40, peaks at its awfulness at rune level 60, and then starts to get better around rune level 90, where the damage the player is able to output catches up to overleveled defenses. So while the builds at rune level 30 are stupid and a little bit nonsensical, they're just all vigor dumps, the invasions are actually kind of good. This also kind of strengthens an opinion I've been meaning to push back on for a little while, and that is that some people seem to believe that the overleveled downscaling algorithm is intentionally terrible to give more advantages to the host side. And I don't really believe that, because if any place in the game you'd want the algorithm to be on the host side and really like punish invaders, you'd want it to be at the lowest levels where new players are just getting into the game. And so it's very, very silly to me that it's actually works early on, and you can actually kill overleveled phantoms early on in the game, and then randomly at mid-levels, nope, you can't do that anymore. It just doesn't work anymore. I just think the algorithm is hard to balance, it's hard to make well, it's also fundamentally broken in a lot of ways that I've pointed out in previous videos, and other more knowledgeable Souls content creators have also pointed out in much more factual ways than me just saying, it's broken. But yeah, I just don't think this is something that FromSoft intends to happen. I think it's one of those classic, like, yes, FromSoft might be geniuses when it comes to like so many different things, but there are other areas where they are borderline incompetent at. People recently have been saying, oh, bring back leaderboards, which is I don't know, like, are we playing the same game? You want a leaderboard in Elden Ring? What game do you think this is? But there have been leaderboards in many of the other Souls games. Just none of them work at all, and that's just something FromSoft is bad at making. I think the algorithm is one of those things that FromSoft is just bad at making. Unfortunate, because it's brutal, but oh well. Alright, enough of that tangent. Let's cover the rest of the tools that this goofy build can use. And of course, what low-level mage would be complete without Night Maiden's Mist? If you've watched any of my videos on any of my builds, you pretty much know we love the mist. And you might ask why? I mean, people stand in the mist, then they die. That's extremely funny. Moving on. So, like I mentioned before, my main weapon on this build is actually the Bloody Hellas, which has 0 synergy with anything else that this build does, but I meet the requirements for it, and it's a heavy thrusting sword with an 8 bleed. That inherently makes it powerful. The Bloody Hellas is essentially my spin out of jail free card. It's flamboyant Bloodhound Step on a stick. Nobody can touch me once I press L2, and it even has a nice couple of follow-up thrusts to punish people who swing into the billion iframes that this Spinaroonie has on it. I know heavy thrusting swords in general are kind of boring because they typically devolve into running R2 spam, but just the absurd range on the running R2 often becomes very handy when chasing people across the limitless space that is the lands between. Am I being hyperbolic here? Probably, but if you want to see me be hyperbolic and complain about limitless space for an hour and a half, boy do I have a video for you. I'm also using the Scepter of the All-Knowing, which is an extremely silly weapon to use at this level, or really any level. Look, I know it drops from an endgame fight, but it's such a bad weapon at practically every level, and it's really just a base damage problem. It's a Dex Int Hammer that is the longest weapon in its class, and has that good spear running R2 that the Morningstar also has, and yet, the weapon does very little real damage. Incredible. The real reason I am using this weapon is because I really am twinked out of my goddamn gourd at this point, so I might as well be using a thematic weapon that is bad. You see these old pictures of jesters or fools, and they all have this silly little scepter. So here we go, I'm using a scepter. And its goofy little trick is that it makes everybody, and I mean everybody, take more magic damage. You'll see me pretty much only use the Ash of War on this weapon when nobody else is a wizard, so that I'm the only one dealing magic damage to people. I think that's how you're supposed to use the weapon in the first place, but whatever. I have another funny little staff I like to use as well, that being Death's Poker. In this scenario, I imagine Death's Poker to be that cane that they use to yank bad performers off a stage in some sort of Looney Tunes-esque scenario, but metaphorically this still works, as I use it to yank awful players out of invasions. I've made a whole video on Death's Poker in the past, and back then I described it as 2 spells on a stick. We've received many patches since that video, and nothing has really changed my opinion on this weapon. I guess I'd say the R2s are a little less good now, since almost all other Greatsword R2s got a buff, but that's fine. I'm mostly just pressing L2 here. Next on the agenda are Rancor Pots. Okay, hold on. Now that I think about it, this is my second death-related tool on this build. And I really should have made this some sort of spooky Deathrite build, and then I could have lied and said that this was the second video in the Age of Prophecy, instead of this demented Court Jester vibe. This is a missed opportunity. Anyways, the Rancor Pots. Consumables in general are kind of funny in this game because their descriptions very often tell you nothing helpful about what they do, nor do they actually list any real indicators of damage numbers, just the scaling. So it was only upon starting to actually use Rancor Pots on this build that I found that they in fact have a very high base damage for this rune level. Like, you can just melt people with these little angry skulls. And the worst part, or best part depending on your perspective, is that you can just fill the air with these floating little skulls by just throwing a billion at your opponents. Like, just keep throwing them, and there's like more skulls that keep popping up and chasing them around. My initial reaction was, ooh, this is getting a little too mean, maybe a little too twinkish. Like, am I bringing actually powerful late game gear to early levels that wasn't intended? But then I remembered that you find the crafting recipe for Rancor Pots in the Weeping Peninsula. So I can only assume this is explicitly what From Software wants me to do. That's how game design works, right? Anyways, Rancor Pots are a little absurd. Sometimes when I'm getting my ass absolutely beat, I'll just start chucking Rancor Pots to see if that bails me out. Often it does, which is dumb, but then so is getting rewarded for swinging directly out of hit stun, which all of these parties seem to do, so I will not feel in the least bit bad for filling their screens with floating skulls that do very real damage. I thought I was pretty much done with the different weapons on this build until I started using the butchering knife. I justify using this big dumb knife on this build because Jesters love props, I think? That's how I'm justifying it. And what's more comical than some giant kitchen utensils? And again, I'm also just now realizing that I missed another golden opportunity to do a knife and fork bit with the butchering knife and the forked greatsword. God damn it, it's really stupid, but would have fit this build perfectly, because this whole build is really stupid. But anyways, this great axe does a similar thing that I've done before, which is to use gravitas to pull people in and then do that unique chopping R2 to do some bigger damage when they are inevitably going to try to swing directly out of hit stun. I do pretty much the exact same thing on my blue blood tinge build, but with the Omen Cleaver, so it feels a little less unique when this character does it. I like great axes a lot, which is unsurprising because everybody loves hyper armor in this 1.10 world we're living in. And ever since great axes got that speed up a couple patches ago, they've been one of my favorite weapon classes in general. They're still not as good as great swords and curved great swords in versatility and quickness, but man, chopping your opponents into tiny bits is endlessly satisfying and silly, and no amount of optimization can ever make me stop chopping. So, in terms of spells, I had pretty much locked up my spell order and loadout, and was pretty set on it, except for one spell in the middle. Initially, I went with Roiling Magma, mostly because I just had the stats for it, but also because it's another goofy little trap to fling at people. Ultimately, I was unsatisfied with it at this rune level, due to the damage not being great and the FP cost still being fairly high. To replace it, I tried Magical Downpour, and I don't think I've ever hit anyone for meaningful damage with it, so I quickly axed that. Then I tried the spell version of Carian Retaliation, and oh my god, that spell is thoroughly garbage. Here's the one and only clip of me using it. Frankly, I was depressed and ashamed. It might have something to do with the fact that I was using the Meteorite Staff, which is technically always at +0, but like many other spells in Elden Ring, the Ash of War is just plain better in every way for Carian Retaliation. In my last couple of sessions with the build, I switched to Rock Blaster, and was actually fairly surprised by how good it was at this rune level. Gavel of Haima is better in practically every way than Rock Blaster, but I used Gavel of Haima on a bunch of other builds anyways, and I wanted to do something a little different here. And for a little while there, I was trying to make an extremely goofy setup with the Irumi and offhand full moon crossbow work, but crossbows in this game are just so bad in so many ways that I very quickly gave up on trying to mess around with this setup entirely. In Elden Ring, you're unfortunately always better off just using some sort of spell, even on melee builds. So the last thing I'll say here is that rune level 30 is deeply unserious, and that's a good thing. I feel like it captures more about what is good about the combat, which is all these different movesets we have access to, because you are able to press buttons like just, I don't know, standing R2s and standing R1s without feeling locked into an animation that could just get you blendered. You don't have to rely on very, very safe attacks, like just non-stop running attacks, because you can kind of engage with your opponents a little bit more, which is a little bit reminiscent of past games. On the flip side, this is also not a great rune level because builds all kind of devolve into vigor gouges. And so your build making is also just far less creative because there's really just like one optimal path. Double source healing is very interesting, but isn't really optimal. And that's another problem with rune level 30, is there are things you can bring to this rune level that are just absurd. Like, we all know about the Dragon Halberd, and it's also not lost on me that yet another dragon-related weapon that does lightning damage is absurd at low levels. But then there's the usual low-level culprits, like Rot at this level, and also lightning pots, and those like ancient dragon lightning pots, which just do like half your health. So it's unfortunate because you have this nice balance at this rune level, but people who really just care about winning and nothing else can just bring things that just have no place in terms of the balance at rune level 30. So it's kind of unfortunate. I like to spend some time here, I like to do some invasions here, but I don't like to stay here for too long because inevitably I run into someone using something absurd, like power stance rapiers that are all buffed with lightning slash. Nonetheless, I would recommend giving a double source heal build a try sometime. It's really kind of interesting, all the different things you can use and that are available to you at this rune level. Following up on the heels of my last video where I had a lot of complaints about a very specific aspect of Elden Ring, I wanted to make this video to point out to all of you that making video games is actually super easily, and honestly anyone can just do it. That's really why there are so many good games coming out this year. People just figured out that games are super fucking easy to make, and that's why Starfield was literally the greatest game of all time. Look, the real reason we've had the ridiculous number of good games in 2023 is because COVID delayed a bunch of game development cycles into this financial year. Take a look at the Game Awards' most anticipated games for 2024, and it is bleak. Like, there is an ebb and flow here. We got really good games in 2023 just because things happen to line up this way, but there's a lot getting pushed out of 2024 into 2025 due to various delays. And these current layoffs that are happening throughout the industry are not going to speed up development. There's going to be a lot happening in 2025, but 2024 I think is going to be kind of a slow year outside of Shadow of the Erdtree. If that launches this year, oh good lord. But let's get back on track here to the main point of the latter half of this video. There's been a lot of discourse surrounding Lords of the Fallen, or there was, because that game came out like more than a month ago at this point, and I totally missed the boat on the time to talk about it. I was really looking forward to the game, probably half for the PvE and half for the online element of it. And like many people are saying, the online element is likely dead on arrival due to how the developers decided to structure their connections in netcode. Its Montage made a great video that I'm going to link on screen and in the description of this video, where he and Stochastic both talk in depth about why the online portions of Lords of the Fallen have failed thus far, and likely will not be fixed anytime soon, if ever. I've seen a couple of different reactions come out of this situation, most of which I feel are pretty reasonable. Some are saying that they thoroughly don't give a shit about Lords of the Fallen now that we know the online portion of it is barely playable, and I really don't blame those people. Personally, I gave up on it because I found the PvE to be fairly boring, and the fact that I knew the online connections were in a very bad state basically killed any enthusiasm I had to finish the game and try out PvP. And considering what I've heard about the end of the game, I think I'm fine missing that. But there have been some incredibly weird takes from the community that have emerged around the Lords of the Fallen's online failures. One of which is to blame the Unreal 5 engine for the terrible connections, citing that it's an engine that values graphical capabilities over better online features. I think the previously cited montage video covers what likely went wrong with Hexworks and Lords of the Fallen, but the point I want to make here is that blaming a dev's choice of engine for their game is maybe the pinnacle of armchair game developer takes, and is one that is born out of either ignorance or purposeful stupidity. A couple weeks ago, I was in a semi-popular content creator stream discussing Lords of the Fallen, and they kept harping on the Unreal Engine, at one point saying, this engine needs to be thrown through a windshield, which is just kind of a weird and nonsensical thing to say about any piece of software, I guess. When I asked this content creator which game engine Hexworks should have chosen for Lords of the Fallen, or what they should choose in the future instead of Unreal 5, they responded with Unity or the Fire engine. Now, Unity is a fine engine that is unfortunately being run to the ground by its shareholders ever since it went public in 2020, and it very much struggles when it comes to graphical fidelity, which by no means is a bad thing. It just typically makes games quite a lot harder to sell to wider audiences. I've worked on several games that use Unity, and whenever trailers for our games would get shown at these larger game trailer events, the chat would be spammed with messages like "lol PS2 game," etc. That is to say that people will see a game with not very good graphics and immediately write it off. So choosing Unity for your first game as a brand new studio making a dark fantasy game that inherently will have to compete with From Software's games, choosing Unity, in my opinion, would be a bit of a risk. So now, the other engine that the content creator mentioned, the Fire engine, is a very unserious answer considering that almost nobody makes games on the Fire engine anymore. And that's because it's an outdated engine whose last major update added support for the PlayStation Vita, a now defunct handheld console from Sony. For reference, no games made with the Fire engine launched in 2023 or 2021. The last game I've actually heard of made on the Fire engine was 2019's Sky Children of Light, a game made by the high-profile indie studio That Game Company, who, by the way, also made my favorite game of all time, Journey. But that's beside the point. Anyways, Sky Children of Light is a mobile game for the iOS system, and in fact, most games made with the Fire engine in the last 5 years are also all mobile games. That's kind of indicative of how powerful of an engine the Fire engine is, and probably not a great choice to build a Souls-like on that is supposed to launch in the year of our Lord 2023. This is all to say, maybe you shouldn't really seriously consider game development critiques from YouTubers in general, but especially from people who have played exactly like one game that they seem to hate for the last year and a half. In fact, I'd stay off YouTube, Reddit, and social media in general for critiques of game development, because realistically the vast majority of YouTubers don't know much about how games are made. They really only know the finished product. And that's why the whole Bethesda needs a new engine narrative really grinds my gears, because the reason you likely don't enjoy Bethesda games anymore isn't because their engine is old, it's because you don't like how their games are designed at this point. You're not really hoping for a new engine, you're hoping for a different focus and design from their games. Bethesda's developers are extremely comfortable with their engine, as many of their developers have worked there for over a decade, and having an engine that your developers are comfortable with is beyond crucial for game development. And time again, capital G gamers don't really appreciate that aspect of game development, and the only reason we ever hear these people talk about game engines is when things go wrong and people with little knowledge of the situation are looking for something to blame. Back in college, I worked for an indie studio on a game built on Unity that was still being developed about 2 years after its original projected launch date. Many things had gone wrong with the project, but one of the numerous reasons for this massive delay was because they built the single-player portion of the game first, knowing at some point they would be pivoting to online co-op. When they decided it was time for that pivot to happen, they then discovered that they would essentially need to rewrite their whole codebase to account for multiplayer. Essentially, they did not plan well enough ahead of time, nor did they have the knowledge of the Unity engine to know that they would have to do this. This is complete speculation, much like the It's Montage video I referenced earlier, but what happened with Lords of the Fallen really sounds like a similar scenario of miscalculations about how hard it would be to implement multiplayer. So finally, let's loop this back to the Unreal Engine. Unreal Engine is an extremely common engine for AA and AAA game developers to use, and it's really quite versatile. Some people claim it's a bad engine for making multiplayer games, and that isn't really true. It just requires you to start early, but that's true of most game engines in general, which is why I just brought up that anecdote about making a game on Unity. And also, are you really going to tell me that the most popular multiplayer game of the last 5 years, it's Fortnite, was built on an engine that is bad for multiplayer? What I've learned about game engines just by working in my field for several years at this point is that all game engines have glaring flaws in some way or another. But what matters more is how well your devs know your engine and their ability to make tools that will support your development with that engine. And because Unreal is used by a ton of studios at this point, it becomes dramatically easier to hire people who have experience working with it. So I really don't fault Hexworks one bit for picking Unreal as their game engine of choice. What they do deserve criticism for is how they implemented their multiplayer connections, which quite frankly are subpar and may never be what a lot of us consider adequate or even playable. Another reaction to this has been a little appreciation for FromSoft, as it turns out that making a full-fledged PvE game that has multiplayer built right into it is actually quite a feat. Are there things that FromSoft could improve? Obviously yes. But I think it's also worth appreciating the fact that FromSoft is one of the only game studios who successfully pulls off the invasion mechanic. The only other studio I've seen do this effectively was Arcane with Deathloop's Invasions, which I never really got into due to how much of a shooter Deathloop really is. Even other high-profile studios have tried and failed to make Invasions work, and I'm mostly thinking of Doom Eternal here, that promised Invasions in the run-up to launch but never followed through. So I have a few questions that I feel like people might want to ask that I want to get out of the way before this video ends. Why didn't Hexworks just use FromSoft's engine that they use to make Souls games? The issue with this is that FromSoft uses a proprietary engine, meaning they own it and everything built on it. So nobody but From Software is making games on this engine, and this engine is not for public use. Which means that everybody who wants to make a Souls-like or something like a Souls-like with PvP built right into its single-player systems has to do so from scratch. They have to build all those systems from scratch, essentially. If Unreal 5 has all these glaring issues, why didn't Hexworks just make their own engine for Lords of the Fallen? Making an engine is an enormous undertaking that quite literally requires nearly half a decade in many cases. There was this popular trend of game studios making their own engines during the early 2010s, and it was a disastrous endeavor for so many of them, bankrupting quite a few studios. There's a reason commercial engines like Unity and Unreal have emerged as popular choices among game developers in the last 10 years, and it's because making your engine is an enormous pain in the ass. And during that time, whatever game you're working on cannot really be worked on until the engine is more or less finished. So yeah, don't make your own engines unless you have a stupid amount of money and absolutely zero deadlines. Will Hexworks ever be able to fix the Lords of the Fallen's multiplayer? Nobody is going to know the answer to this question except Hexworks themselves, and the answer they will always go with publicly and in the immediate future is an optimistic probably. If I had to guess, I would say no. This issue seems quite structural and not something that can simply be patched out. It can be mitigated in some ways, sure, but I bet that extreme latency will always be an issue in the Lords of the Fallen. And even then, by the time a fix comes out, I will likely be playing Shadow of the Erdtree. I hope. Anyways, that's enough rambles about video game engines for me. I have many more builds in the pipeline that I'm going to make videos on soon, but soon is an extremely relative term, so don't hold your breath. People are clamoring for a Shadow of the Erdtree update, just like anything on it, and even though I'm having a lot of fun with the game as it is right now, it could use some fresh air. In the meantime, I will resort to SteamDB patch astrology to hope and pray and read a bunch of file names that I don't really understand and try to decipher when we're going to get some sort of update on this game. But you never know. FromSoft is just insanely cryptic, and it might just drop on like a random Thursday night. Who's to say? If I don't make another video before the end of the year, which is a very, very real possibility at this point, hope you and your families all have a wonderful holiday season and new year. 2023 was a pretty cool year, so I'm hoping for more like it in the future. But that's all from me, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.